The Chrysalids, Chapter 1. When I was quite small, I would sometimes dream of a city, which was strange, because it began before I even knew what a city was. But this city, clustered along the curve of a big blue bay, would enter my mind. I could see the streets and the buildings that lined them, the waterfront, even boats in the harbor. Yet upon waking, I had never seen the sea or a boat, and the buildings were quite unlike anything I knew. The traffic in the streets was also strange. Carts running along with no horses pulling them. And sometimes there were things in the sky, shiny fish shaped things that were certainly not birds. Most often I would see this wonderful place by daylight, but occasionally it was by night, when the lights lay like strings of glowworms along the shore, and a few of them seemed to be sparks drifting on the water and through the air. It was a beautiful, fascinating place, and once, when I was still young enough to know no better, I asked my oldest sister Mary where this lovely city could be. She shook her head and told me that there was no such place, not now. But perhaps, she suggested, I could somehow be dreaming about times long ago. Dreams were funny things, and there was no accounting for them. So it might be that what I was seeing was a bit of the world as it had been once upon a time, that wonderful world that the old people had lived in, as it had been before God sent tribulation. But after that, she went on to warn me very seriously not to mention it to anyone else. Other people, as far as she knew, did not have these pictures in their heads, either asleep or awake, and it would be very unwise to mention it. And it was good advice, and luckily I had the sense to take it. You see, people in our district had a very sharp eye for anything odd or unusual, so that even my left-handedness caused slight disapproval. So at that time, and for some years afterwards, I did not mention it to anyone. I almost forgot the dream, for as I grew older, that dream came less frequently, and then very rarely. But the advice from my sister stuck, and without it, I might have mentioned the curious understanding I had with my cousin Rosalind, and that would certainly have led us both into very serious trouble, if anyone had happened to listen or believe me. Neither I nor she, I think, paid much attention to it at that time. We simply had the habit of being cautious. I certainly did not feel unusual. I was a normal little boy, growing up in the normal way, taking the ways of the world around me for granted. And I kept on like that, until the day I met Sophie. And even then, the difference was not immediate. It is hindsight that enables me to fix that as the day when my first small doubts began to grow. That day, I had gone off by myself, as I often did. I was, I suppose, about 10 years old, and my next sister, Sarah, 5 years older than me, and that meant that I played a great deal alone. I had made my way down the cart track to the south, along the border of several fields, until I came to the high bank. I climbed it, and then walked along the top of the bank for quite a ways. The bank was no puzzle to me then. It was far too big for me to ever think of it as something that men could have built, nor had it ever occurred to me to connect it with the wondrous doings of the old people, whom I sometimes would hear about. It was simply the bank. It came around in a wide curve, and then ran straight as an arrow towards the distant hills. It was just a part of the world, no more to be wondered about than the river, the sky, or the hills themselves. I had often walked along the top of it, but seldom explored the further side. For some reason, I regarded the country there as foreign, not so much as hostile, but simply as outside of my territory. But there was a place I had discovered once, where the rain, when it ran down the far side of the bank, had created a sandy gully, and if I sat at the top of it and gave myself a good push, I could swish down the hill at a fine speed, and finally fly a few feet through the air to land on a soft pile of sand at the bottom. I must have been there about half a dozen times before, and there had never been anyone around. But on this occasion, when I was picking myself up after my third descent and preparing for my fourth, a voice called out, "Hello!" I looked around. At first I could not tell where it came from. Then a shaking of twigs in a bunch of bushes caught my attention. The branches parted, and a face peeked out at me. It was a small face, sunburned, clustered by dark curls. The expression was somewhat serious, but the eyes sparkled. We regarded one another for a moment, and then, "Hello," I answered. She hesitated, and then pushed the bushes further apart, and I saw a girl, a little shorter than I was, perhaps a little younger. She wore reddish-brown dungarees with a yellow shirt, but the cross stitched to the front of her outfit was of a darker brown material. Her hair was tied to either side of her head with yellow ribbons, and she stood still for a few seconds as though uncertain about leaving the security of the bushes. But then curiosity got the best of her, and out she stepped. I stared at her, mainly because she was a complete stranger. From time to time, we would have gatherings or parties which would bring together all the children for miles around, so it was astonishing to me to encounter someone I'd never seen before. "What's your name?" I asked her. "Sophie," she told me. "What's yours?" "David," I said. "Where's your home?" "Over that way," she said, waving her hand vaguely towards the country on my foreign side of the bank. Her eyes left mine and then went to the sandy slope down which I had been sliding. "Is that fun?" she inquired, with a wistful look. I hesitated a moment before inviting her, and then, "Yes," I told her. "Come on up and try." But she hung back, turning her attention to me again. She studied me with the most serious expression, then made up her mind, and she scrambled to the top of the bank just ahead of me. She slid down the runnel with curls and ribbons flying, and when I landed, she had lost her serious look, and her eyes danced with excitement. "Again!" she said, and panted on her way back up the bank. But it was on her third descent that the misadventure occurred. She had sat down and shoved off as before, and I watched her swish down and come to a stop in a flurry of sand. Somehow, she had contrived to land a couple of feet to the left of the usual place, and I made ready to follow her, and I waited for her to get clear, but she didn't. "Go on," I told her impatiently. She tried to move and then called up to me. "I can't, it hurts." I risked sliding anyway and landed close beside her. "What's the matter?" I asked. Her face was all pinched up, and tears were in her eyes. "My foot's stuck," she said. Her left foot was buried. I scrambled the soft sand clear with my hands, and her shoe was jammed in a narrow space between two stones. I tried to move it, but it wouldn't budge. "Well, can't you just kind of twist it out of there?" I suggested. She tried, with her lips pressed together. "It won't work." "I'll help pull," I offered. No, it hurts," she protested. I didn't know what to do next. Very clearly, her situation was becoming painful, and I considered the problem. "Well, I know. We can cut the laces, and then you can slide your foot out of your shoe. I can't reach the knots from here," I decided. "No," she said, alarmed. "No, I can't." She was very emphatic. If she were to pull the foot out of the shoe, we might be able to knock the shoe itself free with a stone. But if she wouldn't do that, I didn't see what else we could do. She lay back on the sand, with the knee of her trapped leg sticking up into the air. "Oh, it's hurting so much," she said, and she could no longer hold back her tears, and they ran down her face. But even then, she didn't really howl. She just made small puppy noises. "You'll have to take it off," I told her. "No," she protested again. "No, I can't. Not ever. I won't." So I sat down beside her, at a loss. Both of her hands held on to one of mine, and gripped it tightly while she cried. Clearly, the pain in her foot was increasing, and for almost the first time in my life I found myself in charge of a situation which needed a decision, so I made it. "It's no good. You've got to take it off," I told her. "If you don't, you're going to stay here and die." But she wouldn't give in at once, but at last she consented. And then she watched apprehensively while I cut the laces. And then she said, "Go away. You can't look." I hesitated, but childhood is a time full of rules and regulations you don't understand. So I withdrew a few yards and turned my back to her. I could hear her breathing hard. And then she cried again, and I turned around. "I can't," she said, looking at me through her tears, and I knelt down to see what I could do to help her. "You can't tell. Ever, she said. Never. You promise? And I promised. She was very brave. Again, nothing more than those puppy noises. And when I did succeed in pulling her foot free, it looked strange. I mean, it was twisted and puffy, and I didn't even notice then that it had more than the usual number of toes. I managed to hammer her shoe out of the cleft in the rock and handed it to her, but she found that she could not put it back on her swollen foot, and nor could she walk on her swollen foot. I thought I might have to carry her on my back, but she was heavier than we expected, and it was clear that we would not get far like that. I'll have to go and fetch someone to help us, I told her. No, I'll crawl, she said. I walked beside her, carrying the shoe and feeling useless. She kept going for a surprisingly long way, but she eventually had to give it up. Her trousers were worn through at the knees, and her knees themselves were now sore and bleeding. I had never known anyone, boy or girl, who would have kept on till that pitch. It awed me slightly. I helped her to stand up on her sound foot and steadied her while she pointed out where her home was, and the trickle of smoke that marked it. And when I looked back again, she was on all fours, disappearing under the bushes. And I found her house without much difficulty, and I knocked, if a little nervously. A tall woman answered. She had a fine, handsome face with large, bright eyes. Her dress was russet brown, perhaps a little shorter than most that were worn by women at home, but it still had the cross sewn on the front, from the neck to the hem and shoulder to shoulder, in a green that matched the scarf she wore on her head. Are you Sophie's mother? I asked, and she looked at me sharply and frowned. And she said, with anxiousness, What is it? And I told her. Oh no, she exclaimed, her foot. And she stared hard at me again for a moment, and then she leaned the broom she was holding against the wall and asked, Where is she? And so I led her back by the way I had come. At the sound of her voice, Sophie crawled out of the bushes. Her mother looked at the swollen, misshapen foot and the bleeding knees. Oh, my darling, she said, holding her and kissing her, and then she added, He's seen it? Yes, Sophie told her. I'm sorry, Mummy. I tried hard. I couldn't do this on my own, and it hurts so much. And her mother nodded slowly and sighed. Oh well, it can't be helped now. Up you get. And Sophie climbed onto her mother's back, and we all went back to the house together.